Welcome to Crosspoint. An interactive program featuring ministers and leaders of the Christian community addressing the issues that are challenging the church today. Here's your host, Mark Taylor.
Welcome to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor. Today our show is going to have a couple of different guests on it. One of them is going to be a very popular speaker. You hear him on Fox News and other places, Gordon G. Chang. He's put out a book entitled Plan Red. It's about China and all the things that's going on behind the scenes. And that's who's going to be joining us today as one of our guests here on Crosspoint. Today with us here on Crosspoint, we've got Gordon G. Chang with us. Now, you hear him as on other shows as well, sometimes as talking about things that go on with the area of China. And he's put out this book entitled Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. And we hear something, I guess, Gordon, every day about China and how it affects America. And so is China really a friend to America like they seem to say they are?
No, it's not. It is an enemy. And we know this because People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, it is the mouthpiece of the Communist Party as it describes itself. It carried a landmark editorial in May 2019 that declared a, quote, People's War on America. People's War is a phrase that has great meaning for the party. Last year, one of the party's outlets actually declared that a People's War means total war. And we have to take it seriously because China has been effectively waging a total war on us apart from the use of force. But they've killed Americans with fentanyl. That's 70 to 75,000 Americans a year. They have stolen perhaps $500 billion of intellectual property each year. This is a total war on the American society.
I know that, they have all kinds of plans, but how is it that China is able to get a hold of and have purchased land here in America? Is that, again, they don't just purchase a piece of land anywhere. They do it for a reason, do they not?
Well, certainly. There are a lot of motivations for why Chinese parties are buying land. Some is just capital flight, but others seem strategic. So, for instance, Fufeng, the Shandong food processor, bought all of those acres within 12 miles of Grand Forks Air Force Base and wanted to build a large food processing plant there from which they could monitor and disrupt signals from that base, which uplinks to satellites and also controls drones. So clearly that was a very suspicious purchase. Also, we know that Chinese parties use land throughout the United States for illegal marijuana grows. They base human trafficking operations in Oklahoma on farmland. So these are very, very troubling purchases of American property. We have an open society. We allow them to do that, but of course we shouldn't be allowing them. Because remember, no American can own a square inch of land in the People's Republic. So as a matter of reciprocity, why are we allowing these dangerous purchases on our land?
Yeah, and that brings up the question. Of course, you talk about it here in your book, Plan Red. For them to be able to carry out their plans, they have to, as you talk about, have people in America that cooperate with them so they can do these kind of things. And that means way up even in the government, does it not?
Well, I think so. We have seen China devote a lot of effort to affecting elections. And in this current election, they have been involved in down-ballot contests in a very direct way. And it's not just down-ballot Senate and House of Representatives. In June, they were messing in the Democratic Party primary for assembly seats in the state of New York. So clearly they have been targeting many, many people throughout our political system.
Now, you talk about in the foreword here of the book about the core crisis that involves the Chinese economy, which you say is not growing robustly as Beijing claims it is. So does China have some problems of their own that they're trying to fight with in their own country that they really are going to have to deal with that could hinder them a little bit, or are they just going to move forward regardless?
Well, they're going to try to move forward regardless, but the crises inside China, and they're simultaneous crises, means that it will undermine their ability to exert power. China's economy is not growing. It's certainly not growing at the 4.6% pace that they claim for the third quarter of this year. It looks more like about zero. But even if it were growing at 4.6, it would not be growing fast enough to retire the debt that China has accumulated, especially since 2008. So they got a debt crisis they can't deal with. They've got an economy which is eroding. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been adopting all the wrong solutions for the economy, and he's driving the country into the ground. And in addition to that, you've got plunging property prices, accelerating capital flight, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, failing local governments. There are problems just across the board. But most fundamentally, they've got a demographic crisis. Yeah. China, which is now 1.4 billion people, probably will lose about two-thirds of its population when the clock strikes 2100.
Yeah, that was the next thing there in your part of your forward there of the book, talking about that problem there. So with that being said, as you talk about there, they have to do something. They have to move. If they're going to make a move, they're going to have to do it quickly. If they feel like they're going the other way, they've got to do it while they've got people, while they've got what they have in an economy. So they've got to have a plan, and you're talking about Plan Red here in this. So is China preparing, as you talk about in the introduction, to plunge the world into a conflict?
They certainly are doing that already. Xi Jinping is involved in proxy wars on 3 separate continents, in Europe, in Ukraine, across North Africa, and in the Middle East, in Israel. And also right now, Xi Jinping is threatening war along his southern and eastern peripheries. He's got troops deep into Indian-controlled territory. He has been slicing through Japanese airspace around the Senkakus in the East China Sea, which the Chinese claim is the Diaoyus. We all know about their dangerous and provocative activities in the South China Sea against the Philippines, primarily, also against Vietnam, and their attempts to annex Taiwan with these provocative military exercises. So China is looking to start global conflict. We got to remember that in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, there were separate wars that merged into what we now call World War II. And we have to ask ourselves, will these conflicts today merge into a global conflict as well? And that answer depends on China.
Yeah. Now, at the start here in the book, I'm looking at page 5, but it talks about how the leadership wants to shape the world into China's image and the concept of the world that there is no place for the United States, not even, you say, in a current international order. Why the United States pretty much got to cease to exist as far as China's leadership is concerned?
Because we block their ambitions. Xi Jinping has been trying to impose China's imperial-era system in which emperors believe that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they call Tianxia, or all under heaven, but that heaven actually compelled them to do so. And since 2017, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. Well, if they're the world's only sovereign state, it means that the United States at most is a colony. And it also, the Communist Party believes it is in an existential struggle with the U.S. And that's not because of anything that we say or do, but it's because of who we are. An insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of our values and form of governance on the Chinese people. So there will never be amicable relations with China as long as the Communist Party rules it. And it also means there's only going to be one survivor. It'll either be the People's Republic of China or the United States of America, not both.
So it's the U.S. that stands, the major player that stands in their way, and that's why they have to be out of there. Well, when I was looking through this book, as getting ready for this, it was back during, as I was preparing, when the Little League World Series was on. And I see China playing in the Little League World Series, which I have several times. But I kept thinking, how do they get into the country to play in this? And if they do come into the country, are they not coming in to spy and to look? And I mean, they wouldn't just be coming to play baseball. I don't think anything they do is just to have fun or anything else, but they've got a reason for being here. Is that a good way to look at that? Or I don't know, but it seems like they get a lot of access to the country through these areas that they could use to come in and infiltrate into things in our country.
Well, China uses every point of contact to take down our society. But you were probably looking at what's called Chinese Taipei, which is really Taiwan. And Taiwan is no friend of the People's Republic. Xi Jinping has staked his credibility on and his legitimacy on annexing Taiwan. But the people in Taiwan don't consider themselves to be Chinese. And we know this from self-identification surveys, where surveys show that at least two-thirds, and usually over 80% of the people, believe that they are Taiwanese only, not Chinese. And the portion of the population that thinks of themselves as Chinese only is never higher than 7% and is now these days around 3 and 4%. So you don't have to worry about the Little League team from Taiwan, but you do have to worry about everything else that comes from China.
Now, I have seen and I've read and I've got credible reports that a lot of Chinese have come across our southern border and got into the United States, and especially young men of fighting age. My question is, you don't just leave China, do you? You just can't get on a plane and leave China to go wherever you want to, like we can in the United States.
Yes, you need a passport, which only the government issues, of course, and you generally need an exit permit. When we go back 2 years ago, most of the Chinese migrants were family groups. In other words, people who were desperate to leave China and wanted to live in a free society. But the composition of Chinese migrants has changed, and now, as U.S. Border Patrol reports, at least two-thirds of the migrants are single males of military age, traveling without family members, some of them pretending not to speak English. Border Patrol knows that some of them have links to the Chinese military. So there's been a very different composition of migrants, and now it's much more suspicious. And some of them are undoubtedly operatives. And we can see this because, just from an example from our northern border, in February, 3 Chinese migrants were apprehended by Border Patrol trying to sneak into Maine. There was a 4th Chinese national on our side of the border who was obviously there by prearrangement, trying to help them get in. Now, if you want to live in a free society, you want to surrender to Border Patrol because you get a free debit card from New York City and you get all sorts of benefits. If you're trying to come in undetected, it means you're coming here for some nefarious purpose. We may not know exactly what that purpose is in the case of a specific individual, but we do know that they're coming here for no good.
Now, I'm reading on page 25 of the book, and it talks about President Joe Biden's comments, and we're talking about the Chinese spy balloon, which, surveyed sensitive military sites in the United States. That was in January and February 2023. And you've shown even today in America, policymaking community has great tolerance for these belligerent Chinese conduct. You say the balloon incident shows Beijing's utter disrespect for the United States. So in other words, China is not too much afraid of the United States, and they feel like they can do kind of what they want to?
Well, yes, and that balloon incident was very clear. That rather large object floating across our country, surveilling nuclear weapon sites, and that takes a certain boldness, and obviously they do not believe that the Biden administration is up to opposing them. And we also see this in the South China Sea, Mark, where these very belligerent, and some of them are acts of war against the Philippines. And this is despite 12 written warnings from the Biden State Department that the United States is prepared to use force to discharge our obligations pursuant to our 1951 Regional Defense Treaty with Manila. But it's also President Biden's 3 oral warnings to the same effect. And clearly the Chinese are ignoring all that because they don't believe our word.
Now, folks, we are talking with Gordon Chang about Plan Red, book that he's put out. Gordon, if people want to find out more about this book and basically, what you do and your work, how would they go about doing that?
I tweet important developments at Gordon G. Chang, GordonGchang, and I archive my articles for free on my website, www.gordonchang.com. And the book is available wherever books are sold.
All right. Well, folks, stay with us, and we're going to have more right after this.
Did you know it's God's will for you to mature as a believer? Ephesians 4:11-16 says that God's goal for the body of Christ is to attain the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. As we study the Word and allow the Holy Spirit to reveal and work His Word in us, the result will be that we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth on the winds and waves of every doctrine. I'm Pastor Andy Stump of Victory Christian Center. I'd love for you to join me on my program, Victory is Mine, as we delve into the Word of God to see what God has done for us in Christ. Listen on KNEO at 7:05 a.m. Monday through Friday, or listen wherever you get your podcasts. It's also available from the Sky High Podcast Network. God bless.
This is Mark Taylor. If you miss a broadcast of Crosspoint, you can always go to our website at www.kneo.org and click on the programs page. There you can access the current Crosspoint program as well as the last 4 programs that have been aired. Never miss another Crosspoint program again. Go to www.kneo.org today. Welcome back to Crosspoint. I'm talking today with Gordon G. Chang. We're talking about Plan Red, China's project to destroy America. Folks, we hear about it all the time. It's on the news. I don't think probably a day goes by that something about China doesn't come up. And on page 37 of the book, the Chinese, you're talking about the Communist Party openly supporting sorts of political activism in the U.S., and then would get people sent to work camps in China and stuff like that. But before that, you mentioned about Mao's Little Red Book and stuff. Is there a lot of stuff that's already been said, kind of like this, that just tells this is the way we do things in China, and regardless of whether people go along with it or not, they're forced into it or they're put somewhere where they, if they disagree, people in China don't have any say really in much of anything that goes on there. Is that correct?
Yes, it's always been a totalitarian state, and it's becoming much more obvious now that it is totalitarian, not, as many people say, authoritarian, because Xi Jinping runs this what's called now digital totalitarianism. He's got 700 million surveillance cameras. He uses 1.69 billion cell phones to track people. They've got a nationwide social credit system which scores people on their political behavior. So really what we have seen is the world's most successful coercive state. And they are developing new ways all the time to track and monitor people. Nonetheless, every once in a while the Chinese people explode. That happened, for instance, in October 2022, where we saw a series of extraordinary protests across the country. But they did die down after about 3 months. And so right now, the Chinese people are quiet, but the regime knows that they can go ballistic at any time.
Now, Chapter 4 of the book, it's titled Killing Americans, and you do bring up something that's been a very big controversy across the scale. And it's talking about the SARS, the COVID-19 virus, that China's involvement in that. China surely had a hand in this in a more dastardly way, I look at it, than just something accidentally happening.
When you look at SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen that causes COVID-19, it was almost certainly engineered at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And that we know about 99%. But there's something, Mark, that we know 100%, and that is that this virus, once it got out into the Chinese public, was deliberately spread beyond China's borders by Xi Jinping. We know this for 2 reasons. First of all, the regime knew for at least 5 weeks that this pathogen was highly transmissible human to human, but they told the world it was not. This was in December 2019 and January 2020. And they may have even known longer than that, but at least for those 5 weeks. And then while they were locking down their own country, and lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down their own country, they were telling the world they thought this was an effective way to stop disease. So while they were locking down their own country, they were pressuring other countries to take arrivals from China without travel restrictions or quarantines. And you put those 2 things together, and it means that Xi Jinping murdered 7 million people outside of China who died from COVID-19, including 1.2 million Americans. Now, I know that the death toll is controversial. Those numbers come from the Johns Hopkins coronavirus tracker. But let's say something, and that is any death above 0 was completely unacceptable. And so we have to do something about the murder of 1.2 million Americans.
We've also got, the saber rattling, as you were talking about. They're really making a big issue with Taiwan. Is that really into their plans? I mean, could we actually hear about this any day? Could we get up some morning and find out that Taiwan was invaded and there's a war going on and missiles have been fired and all of that? Could that actually happen? Are we that close to those things happening?
We should be prepared for anything at any place at any time. Now, I can make an argument why China will not start hostilities with an invasion of the main island of Taiwan. But we do know that on the island itself, officials have been telling visiting foreigners that they expect China to impose a quarantine within 6 months. And a quarantine, which is not an act of war, will, at least in these circumstances, probably lead to a blockade, which is an act of war, and that could end up in very much a shooting war. So, yes, this is coming very soon. Yeah. And we are not prepared because although Xi Jinping talks about going to war all the time and is preparing China for war, not only the military but civilians as well, we have a political establishment that believes we're at peace. And so we are very vulnerable. Even though we're a far stronger society than China, we could be taken down by China because we're not protecting ourselves and we're not getting ready for what is obviously going to happen.
Okay, so the question would be, and I know you talk about it too in here, why isn't America preparing for this kind of stuff? Why doesn't America take a harder stand against China?
There are a lot of reasons for it. First of all, we're Americans, so we think that we have a God-given right to ignore what our enemies say about us. But also, there was the euphoria after the Cold War, where we believed that history had ended, as the political scientist Francis Fukuyama had so famously said. Also because we have elements in our society that have been bought off by China or intimidated by China. So all of those reasons, you put them together, and we are a society unprepared. And so we're ignoring what could very well be an attack on the United States. I mean, we are being attacked in the sense of fentanyl and intellectual property theft and in other ways, but this could be a kinetic attack as well. Many people think it could never happen, and that's when things happen.
Speaking of the tax things going on, we got the war in the Middle East constantly stirred up, but China gets a lot of its oil and stuff. That all comes from that Middle East, so they have to work with people like Iran and those different kinds of governments to be able to have the oil they need to operate with. So they're going to always kind of be in bed with those folks, are they not?
Well, certainly with Iran. And Iran could not have afforded to attack Israel on October 7th of last year were it not for China's support. China's support has been almost across the board. There's been elevated commodity purchases, diplomatic, propaganda support, weapon support. Just to give you an example of how extensive this is, last year China took over 90% of Iran's exports of crude oil, even though they were sanctioned by the United States, sanctions which the Biden administration has failed to enforce. So China feels that it can do what it wants, and so therefore it has embroiled the Middle East in a conflict that is spreading.
On pages 76 and 77 of the book, you talk about military fighters can link up with China agents who are already in place. And you talk about how agents will take down America's power lines, could poison reservoirs, assassinate officials, start wildfires, and do a whole bunch of different things. But you talk about that almost certainly American military bases would be attacked, and China has already been probing these sensitive installations. You say Chinese agents posing as tourists have, for instance, intruded the bases, and you mentioned one in Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks, Alaska, where these suspected Chinese agents are at. So China's got a lot of foreign agents in our country laying out this plan.
Yes. Just last month, a Chinese national with a Canadian passport tried to get onto a U.S. nuclear weapons site. And their intrusions and attempted intrusions into American military bases by foreign nationals, primarily Chinese, occurs weekly. And that's preparation for an attack. They're looking at our patterns, trying to find our vulnerabilities. It's a clear war signal, and we are purposely trying to ignore this. And so we are particularly vulnerable to an attack. And Mark, this will be the first time that we Americans will have fought a sustained battle with a foreign enemy on American soil since the War of 1812. That's how bad this could get.
Now, you talk about the interest that people have in the Communist Party, and you're talking about this here on page 84 of the book, where you talk about too many Americans now have an interest in supporting the Communist Party. Even billionaire Elon Musk, who loves to talk about freedom while he is in America, bends the knee to China in his Teslas and talked about signing a pledge to the Communist Party to demand that they promote core social values. So China gets you one way or the other.
Yes, and Elon Musk is critical because he is behind SpaceX and America's efforts to return to the moon and to explore space. They're extremely dependent on SpaceX. So we have to be concerned that China will use his vulnerability on Tesla to get what it wants on SpaceX, something which has been discussed in Senate committees. Now, Elon Musk is a hero. I hope that he would be impervious to that, but we've got to be concerned because the potential is there.
Yeah. You talk about also here in the book, page 90, you talk about the risky and dangerous course of action of all who continue with the approaches to create these situations in the first place. But it's now obvious, you say, that the current policies will not, dissuade the Communist Party from its hostile path. And then that last paragraph is really interesting. You say, China cannot attack America without America's money and technology, and it's time for America to quit supplying this stuff to them.
Yes, with our trade, with our investment, with our technical cooperation, we are fueling the Chinese war machine. And this is not only strategically wrong, of course, it's morally wrong.
Yeah. We hear from this side, that there's a church in China, and I know they have a state church and all that, but there is an underground church there that is pretty big, is it not, there in China?
The Protestant underground church is in the tens of millions. We don't know how large. It could be as large as the Communist Party, which would be about 100 million people. We just don't know. Because it is banned, it is impossible to know how many people actually participate in it. And it's not just impossible for us, it's also impossible for the Communist Party. The underground Protestant churches are very vibrant. They are fervent. They are almost impervious to the Communist Party. As the party persecutes it, it grows, and the party has no answers to it. People in the party don't really believe in it, most of them, but the underground Protestants, they believe in Jesus, and they are not going to be dissuaded or deterred.
And so then that would mean that they are kind of a real thorn in the flesh to the communist government there, because they can't get rid of them, and when they do touch them, they just explode and grow more and become bigger. And at some point, they have to see them as, I guess, a threat to them, if anything.
They do. The Communist Party does, but they don't have to. I mean, the Communist Party, though, just will not permit any other grouping, and so therefore they have fueled the rise of the underground Protestant churches. It didn't have to be this way. I mean, it could be live and let live, but that's not the way the party operates.
So in your book here, you've kind of laid out, you've told what China is up to, their projects to destroy this country. You've even given us some information in here to say, here's what we need to quit doing if we want to put a stop to this. And what are you hoping that people will gain when they pick up this Plan Red book and read about what you've, because you've got probably one of the better people to get an inside look at what goes on with China and how it affects America?
What I want the American people to do is to understand the malicious nature of China's assault on our country. We have a political system that believes that they can cooperate with China. I don't think that that's possible. And if we don't start defending ourselves, we will lose our country.
Now, Gordon, again, tell me and tell us all here, how does people go about getting a book Plan Red, and also maybe following you on your blogs, your tweets, whatever you do there?
Yeah, I tweet at Gordon G. Chang, GordonGChang. I archive my articles for free at my website, which is www.gordonchang.com.
All right. Well, Gordon, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today here on Cross Point. Very informative, and I hope our listeners pay attention and read this book, Plan Red.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Well, folks, very interesting book there by Gordon Chang, Plan Red. We've got all kinds of things going on in our world, folks, and people like Gordon Chang out there trying to tell us what we need to know. Thought it was very interesting how he talked to the power of the church that's really probably the most persecuted, or one of them, in the whole world, and yet the power that they have and the availability to just explode and to grow under persecution. Why? Because it's the truth of the other book in my other hand, the Bible, the Holy Word of God. Because they believe in the Bible and these words are inspired and alive, because of that, these people are able to do great things for God, even under persecution. The Bible, folks, it's a book you've got to read. It contains the most important words in the world you need to read and ever certainly need to be following. Be sure to join us again next time as we get to discuss issues that are affecting the church. Have a great week. Allow God to use you for His purposes so that greater things can be done. Make your life count. God's plans for eternity. I'm Mark Taylor.
Hello, I'm Pastor Alan Brock, and I host Standing Firm radio show and podcast. Because standing firm is not easy, we are in a battle against Antichrist opponents. That's why we do this show. Because everything we need, we have in Christ, and in Christ, we win. I invite you to listen to Standing Firm on Saturday mornings at 11 a.m. on KNEO 91.7, or you can listen anytime or wherever you get your podcast. Just search Standing Firm with Alan Brock. Listen or subscribe to Standing Firm with Alan Brock, brought to you by the Sky High Podcast Network.
Offering words to encourage, teaching to inspire, and truth that defines real life.
This is who we are, what we offer, and what you can expect.
91.7 The Word.
Okay, folks, here on Crosspoint now, we're going to go to Ed Vitagliano. He's the Executive Vice President for the American Family Association, and he's put out a little article about the progressive threat to the American Republic, and we're going to talk to Ed about this. Ed, thanks for joining us here on Crosspoint. Appreciate you taking the time out to help us fill in here on our program. And you had written this book, The Progressive Threat to the American Republic. You got a lot of good stuff in here, but we could talk a lot longer than 15 minutes on these things, because you have really kind of pointed out some stuff that's going on. And you say it's time for divisiveness in America that has not been since the late 1960s. That's been a long time.
Yeah, and I think even people who have not paid a whole lot of attention to culture and politics, or especially politics, I think even those folks are noticing with alarm that our country is absolutely split down the middle. When I was growing up, I was born in 1958, so by 68, 70, I started paying attention a little bit to what my dad was watching on television. And the split there was a lot of times about what to do with tax dollars, for example. The old question, guns or butter? Do we spend it on the military? Do we spend it on building more prisons? Do we help the economy? But everybody seemed to be in agreement about basic American principles and our founding principles. That divide seems to be far gone now. Now we have, I think, two mutually exclusive worldviews at war in our country, and it's tearing the people apart.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. The way you're talking about that, you've got a part in here on page 8 of the book. You said, truth convicts the conscience of sin, and conviction is painful. You think that's where the big pushback is coming, because really people know better?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely on that level, Mark. I think at the core of the big political and cultural controversies in our culture, at its core, this is an argument about God. This is an argument about whether there is a God, whether He is the God of the Bible, whether there will be a judgment, whether people will stand before God and answer to Him for the ways in which they've conducted their lives. And so you have, of course, the Christian community. You have kind of the part of our culture that was influenced by Christianity. And then you have this growing segment that just hates God. like right out of Psalm 2. They want to cast away the restrictions of God's Word, and I think it is really on that level, as you suggest, when you see the kind of anger and hostility people have towards pro-lifers, for example. It's not just that they have a disagreement. This is something on a more visceral level, and I absolutely think it has to do with going that deep into a person. I'm reminded of some of the chapters in the book of Acts when the Apostle Paul was preaching and people were getting saved, and they were throwing away their occultic books and their implements of idol worship, and the people in the city of Ephesus responded with, "Great is Diana, or Diana of the Ephesians, or Artemis of the Ephesians," depending on whether Roman or Greek culture. And I think that's what we have going on in our society. There are people who are so angry with the idea of God that they are shouting back their own particular idolatrous ideologies, and we see it on college campuses, but we see it in corporations. It is really evidence of a deep and widespread spiritual war.
Now, Chapter 2 of this booklet is titled Natural Law. The founders saw moral truth in creation. You got objective laws, objective rights, objective morality, objective judgment. Then you got questions at the end of these, which would make some good discussion points if a group wanted to kind of study this, or a church Sunday school class or anything like that. But the part down here on page 13, you say, what did the founders believe about natural judgment? And so you talk about what our founders believe there. What would happen if we did stray away from these moral principles? I mean, that's what we're doing, but is what we're seeing right now because we are straying away from what the founders were telling us not to do?
Absolutely. Of course, America is not a covenant nation with God like Israel was, but many of the founders here understood. I mean, these were historians. They studied the democracies of the Greek city-states. They studied the fall of the Roman Republic. They studied these experiments in liberty. What they set up was they tried to establish a nation with a government that would avoid a lot of the pitfalls that, humanly speaking, come about when you give people liberty. But the primary foundation upon which they believed liberty must be based was morality. In fact, George Washington, in his farewell address, said that political prosperity is absolutely dependent upon the two pillars of religion and morality. And the reason the founders understood this was the freer a people were, the more they had to be restrained inside. And once people dropped the restraint that comes from religion and morality, and I think it's clear that the founders knew that that religion would be Christianity, the more people stray from that internal restraint that comes from a desire to obey God, the more human nature has to be restrained by government. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing government that is forced to restrain people because they cannot govern their own passions. You know, sometimes judgment comes from outside, sometimes it's dramatic, sometimes it's sudden, and then sometimes God just lets their culture decay on its own because they are purposefully departing from his commandments. And I think we're seeing that second type of judgment play out. Our country is decaying and breaking apart at the seams, and I think it's because we've turned our back on God.
Oh, no doubt. And Chapter 3, you talk about the bloodless coup, and you're talking about, of course, humanist here. And you say humanism is an ideology, is a rejection of God and the elevation of man to the highest place on earth. And then you talk about secular progressives. They're talking that they have worked hard to change and alter the very nature of our republic in ways that count most. So where do they start doing this at? I'm assuming the educational system had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people think that progressivism started in the 1960s, and of course, there was a sexual element to the progressive ideology that really came to the forefront in the 60s and 70s. But progressivism itself in this country began to take root after the Civil War. From about 1880 to 1920, it was very publicly expressed, even by people like Woodrow Wilson, when he before he ran for president, became president, when he was the governor of New Jersey. A lot of these individuals began to put their faith in human ingenuity, human reason, the scientific method, and the word progressivism comes from their belief that humanity would continue to progress. We just have to put the experts in charge. Now, it kind of publicly went underground after World War I. World War I, because of the horrors of that war, shattered the public belief in human progress because science was being used to kill people, machine guns and tanks and poison gas. But progressivism as an idea did not disappear. It went underground. And by underground, I meant it went into our law schools. It went into many of our seminaries. And by the middle of the century, by the middle of the 1900s, people who had gone to seminaries infected with this ideological virus were teaching a whole new generation of ministers, and lawyers who had been kind of taught this idea in law schools were now judges. And so you had the Supreme Court just basically banishing the Bible and the Ten Commandments and prayer from public schools. Where did this idea come from? Well, it came from law schools that had been infected with this idea that there was no God, that human beings were really the only ones who were around. They were in charge, and you had to have a man-centered approach to life. And so these Supreme Court justices just simply, without any prior decisions, without anything in our culture, just started striking down biblical influence because Christianity was a competitor to atheism. And that's why we see this kind of suddenly develop even without prior Supreme Court precedent.
So I guess then these progressives believe that there's no really source of truth except what the truth they have. In other words, they're trying to excommunicate God out of society. You can have a God, but it can be whatever. And this is kind of back to the old playbook, isn't it?
You can hear all these arguments when people debate policy issues or this bill or that bill. You can hear people say, listen, it's fine, you can have your belief in God, you just can't discuss your religious belief in public. I remember Hillary Clinton famously, in the run-up to the 2016 election, she began to talk about freedom of worship rather than freedom of religion in terms of the First Amendment. That was a very crafty approach to the First Amendment. What Hillary Clinton and others like her were suggesting is the First Amendment gives you permission to worship the way you want inside the four walls of your church, but you are not allowed to come out into the public square and express your religious beliefs, nor are you allowed to vote on bills based on your religious belief. And it is kind of going back to the original playbook. In the Garden of Eden, I mean, I hate to make this, this elementary, but this is exactly the temptation that was placed upon Eve. She was tempted to see freedom as being human, the human ability to make decisions without God and desire to become wise on your own apart from God. And what we have is an atheistic view of this world that says matter is all there is. It's materialistic. Humanism comes from that, and it means man's on top and man's in charge because there's no God. Secularism is the approach to life that is man-centered, and progressivism is the belief which human beings should be in charge, the experts. And listen, I'm not trying to bring up, tear open old wounds, and whatever your audience thinks about taking the vaccine during the time of COVID. All we heard, I'm talking about the process here, all we heard is don't be a science denier, listen to the experts, listen to the World Health Organization, because you don't know what's best for you. We'll tell you. The experts will tell you. We see in public schools We see parents being told, we're not going to allow you to see your health records for your children. If we want to allow your child to determine what gender they are, we're going to keep it from you. This mentality is progressivism writ large. It is the idea that parents don't know enough to raise their children properly. The education experts will tell you what to do. And I think people are waking up, and I think, ironically, they started waking up during COVID as their kids were learning remotely, learning from home on Zoom. The parents started hearing what the teachers were teaching. Now parents are starting to get involved, but we have got to be involved in this fight, or these so-called experts, they'll be making every decision for us.
Yeah. Chapter 5 of the book, The Levantine State, you're talking there, secular humanists demand unconditional obedience, which we see that a lot. By the way, that is kind of a scary picture you got there on that one.
Yeah, well, the graphics person did that. Yeah.
You talk about it, the state as monster. The state is monster. Well, I think we are seeing a monster that is uglier or ugly as that picture that's on the chapter there. This is the idea that, see, if there is no God and there is no Bible to tell us how to behave, then who tells us? Okay, and this is what the modern belief in the all-powerful state is all about. I quoted a political theorist in that chapter from Germany, Carl Schmitt, who was promoting the idea of the all-powerful state as the Nazis were rising to power in Germany. I did a fair amount of reading about his views. He says that he calls it the Leviathan state, and it comes from an older political idea of the state having power. And he says Leviathan demands unconditional obedience. I'm quoting from him now. He says, there exists no right of resistance to him, neither by invoking a higher nor a different right, nor by invoking religious reasons and arguments. Leviathan, in other words, the state, will tell everyone what's right and what's wrong. And the reason they do that is because there's nobody else there. They don't believe that there's a God. And they don't believe that human beings, ordinary human beings, in this booklet, I quote Woodrow Wilson, who complained about Americans not being docile like Europeans, Americans always wanting to vote on everything. And he says, listen, you got to trust the cooks in the kitchen. You've got to trust the administrative state to do what's right for the country. And listen, that doesn't sit well with a lot of people who believe our rights and our liberties come from God, like the Declaration of Independent States. Ed, you're the executive vice president there of the American Family Association. This little booklet, resources, you have a lot of these different resources there at AFA. So tell people, if they want to know more about this progressive threat to the American Republic, or really anything else that American Family does, how do they go about doing that? Well, thank you, Mark. They can go to afa.net, and across the top banner, there's a little drop-down menu called Resources. And if they click on that and go to our resource page, they can simply type in the progressive threat to the American Republic. That booklet is available because we want people to be able to give this away. And I also did a video with this same material in it that folks can show to a Sunday school class. But there's all kinds of other resources there because AFA exists, American Family Association exists to inform, equip, and activate individuals to get involved, because that's what's going to take. Shows like yours, listen, informing people and encouraging them to take a stand. Mark, it is way past time. We can't just sit around streaming, content. Relax. Everyone needs to kick their feet up, but the time for not being involved is past. Well, Ed, thanks so much for what American Family Association does and your part in it. And thanks for being our guest today here on Crosspoint. Mark, it's been my pleasure. God bless you and your audience. Well, folks, very good interviews we had here today. My goodness, we've just had to take in a lot. These books I was talking about today, they all come from the one main book in my other hand, the Holy Bible. The Bible that you need to be paying attention to, it's accurate. It's never outdated. It works. It's got the most important words you're ever going to read and you ever need to be following daily. So be sure and join us again next time as we again discuss issues that are affecting the church. Have a great week and allow God to use you for His purposes. Make your life count in God's plans for eternity. I'm Mark Taylor.
Crosspoint is a program produced in Studio 101 at KNEO Radio. Not all of the views on Crosspoint reflect those of the management or staff of KNEO. You may contact the Crosspoint program at 10827 Highway 86 East, Neosho, Missouri 64850, or by email crosspoint@kneo.org. You can hear Crosspoint 4 times a week: Saturday morning at 1, Saturday afternoon at 2, Saturday evening at 9, and Sunday evening at 7. You can also listen anytime online at kneo.org.
Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri is proud to be sponsoring this portion of broadcasting on KNEO. Owned by Judy and Danny Harper, Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri specializes in French Bulldogs. For more information, the phone number is 417-628-3083.
Hi, this is Luke Taylor with the Sky High Podcast Network. If you've been blessed by the program that you're listening to, I'd like to personally ask you to consider supporting our station. Our network is a collection of programs produced by KNEO Radio in Neosho, Missouri, a nonprofit station dedicated to educating Christians, reaching the lost, and making an eternal impact. This program is just one of many designed to encourage, equip, and inspire you in your walk with Christ. To help keep these programs going strong, visit kneo.org and click the donate button. And if you'd like to let us know in the memo line that you're a listener of this program, we would truly appreciate it. Thank you for being part of what we're doing here at the Sky High Podcast Network. If today's program spoke to you, please prayerfully consider supporting our mission. Together, we can make a difference for eternity.